Welcome to Practical Presentation Pointers, preparing for painless presentation and delivery. In our last video, we talked about the importance of content and structure and how that can help you avoid looking like Miss Teen South Carolina. You might have poise and everything, but you really have to have a message that is structured thinking about your audience. But I do have to tell you that it's not all about content, and I offer this video as example A. Let me just get back to it here for a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Stark County Republican Party Executive Committee, good evening, and thank you not only for your attendance, but for allowing me the opportunity to speak. My name is Bill Davidson, and I am seeking our party's nomination for the position of Stark County Treasurer on November 10th. November of 2010, excuse me. In terms of my background, I am from the village of Minerva, where I'm serving my 13th year of elected service as a Minerva Council member. In terms of education, I have a bachelor's degree in sociology, a bachelor's degree in history, a master's degree in public administration, and a master's degree in communication.
All right, I think we've seen enough of Phil, but I think that we can all agree that it's not really all about content and that you need to consider your delivery. The most important thing is to be able to build a connection with your audience, and you do that in two ways, which is what we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to talk about some practical tips, and we're also going to talk about how you use your visual aids. So, first of all, let's start off by talking about some practical presentation and delivery tips. Have you ever seen a presentation where somebody is talking to the screen and you're just seeing the side of their face? There's a really simple little trick to be able to avoid having this happen, and that is that whenever you're in a room, you make sure that your toes are pointed to the back wall. And you also don't need to make a lot of movement. You can, in advanced speech courses, they sometimes talk about how do you move appropriately from one subject to another physically. I've found that really one of the best strategies for making sure that you're paying attention to your audience is keeping your toes to the back wall. We're going to talk about the T-zone and how that relates to keeping your audience engaged, but the most important thing to remember is ask yourself throughout your presentation, are my toes pointed to the back wall? If they are, it's going to be very hard to turn around and face the screen and have your audience see your back. So, toes to the back wall. The other thing is, if you don't have a microphone, you want to try and bounce your voice. And what I mean by that is, I have almost never heard a presentation that was too loud. But I have heard a lot of presentations where the presenter didn't command the room well enough. And so in order to get command of the room, what you want to do is speak loudly enough so that you can hear a slight echo from your voice. If you hear that bounce or that echo, you know that you're speaking loudly enough. There are a couple of eye contact tricks, and it depends on the size of the room. But one of the things, if you're in a larger room, you can actually just look over the tops of people's heads, and that will appear as if you're making eye contact. And another eye contact trick is that you can actually look at the middle of somebody's forehead, and it will appear as if you are making eye contact. But you want to make eye contact, and you want to make it throughout the room, and you don't just want to focus on one or two people. I can tell you that as an instructor who grades, I sometimes have students who look directly at me. And first of all, that freaks me out. But secondly, that also means that other people in the room are feeling isolated. And keeping eye contact with your audience is a way to keep them engaged. If you are not looking at them consistently, they are going to drift off and you're going to lose them. So eye contact is another way to keep your audience engaged. As we talked about previously, sometimes people really focus on presentation and delivery and their anxiety. And it has been studied that one of the best ways to eliminate any anxiety or eliminate as much anxiety as possible is to create muscle memory. For those of you who are athletes, you have probably practiced a drill or a skill over and over and over and over again until it becomes automatic. And we think that because words are coming out of our mouths, that giving a speech should be like second nature. And hopefully, if you've seen the structure that we talked about in terms of putting together content, you know that that's not really typical for you to structure your thoughts that way in an everyday conversation. So giving a speech is a skill that has to be practiced over and over and over again to become good at it. Now, there's a trick here because you want to become so practiced that you eliminate your anxiety, but not so practiced that you come off sounding like a robot who's just had everything memorized. If you read your speech or you come across sounding memorized, that's another way that you are going to lose your audience. So build that muscle memory and really talk to your audience. A speech is really communicating information just like you're doing when you're talking to somebody, but it's done in a slightly more formal way. Also, studies show that with anxiety builds and generally reaches its peak shortly after you know that you're on. So anxiety can build and build and build and build, and the minute that you know that you're up, that's when anxiety tends to peak. And it takes somewhere from 5 to 10 minutes for the anxiety to level off to where it's going to eventually get to. And some speeches, like the ones in our class, don't even last that long. So a really good tip for making sure that you can help reduce that anxiety is to really build that muscle memory for your introduction. And as a reminder, your introduction should include that awesome attention getter, your thesis, and your credibility statement. So have that down pat, know exactly what you're going to say, and the rest of it should really be pretty much smooth sailing. Now this goes to what I was talking earlier in terms of your toes pointed to the back wall. And it also goes along with eye contact and what I mentioned earlier about movement. The thing is, you don't have to really get fancy with movement. And sometimes when you have a projector, if you try to move too much, you end up with that deer in the headlights look because you're trying to avoid that light coming directly into your eyes. So there's something that is called the T-zone, and that's not that oily section in the middle of your face. Instead, what that says is you are gaining the attention of the people who are directly in front of you and then spread out in a T shape. And what happens is if you keep that T shape and you don't change the angle of the T, you're only going to be engaging the people directly in front of you and those fanned out in the T shape behind. So what you want to do is you want to change the angle of the T, and that takes us back to pointing your toes to the wall. As long as your toes are pointed to the back wall, you can change exactly where they're pointed to on the back wall. So as you shift where your toes are, your body is going to shift and your T-zone is going to shift as well. And that way, you're going to now engage a new group of people with that, what I'll call a radiating T. That is also why, I know some of you are not going to like hearing this, but that is also why you should never stand behind a lectern or something like that. Because, first of all, it creates a barrier between you and your audience. And that barrier, even though it's physical, is going to turn into a mental barrier because it's going to help your audience tune out. You're going to get lost behind that lectern. And the other reason you don't want to stand behind a lectern or a podium is because you can't really change your T as easily. So that also brings us to a concept that I want to share with you that's called KTAV, and that is that as you're building your speech and you're creating your content, you want to think about engaging people kinesthetic, tactily, audio, and visually. So kinesthetic, tactile means have them do something. Ask people by a show of hands. Take your pencil and write this down. Turn to the person next to you and look them in the eye. If you have people doing something physical, you can also continue to engage them. And again, it's a neat little trick for taking the emphasis off you as the speaker and really putting it on your audience. Audio is going to be an automatic part of your speech because that's the speaking part, and that leads us into the next part of our presentation, which is going to be talking about using visual aids to help engage your audience. So we've talked about all those practical presentation and delivery steps. Now we're going to talk about PowerPoint and Prezi. You guys are probably very familiar with PowerPoint, so I have done these two videos in Prezi just to show you what it's like. But the rules for whatever visual aid you use are the same. And hopefully, most importantly, I have modeled simplicity. The number one problem with visual aids is that people try to cram every single last blessed thing that they're saying into their visual aid. And you need to make them simple. Simpler, the better. But let's talk about a few specifics. First of all is the 7x7 rule. That means, including the heading, you should have no more than 7 lines of text and no more than 6 words per line. And that is an absolute maximum. You will notice that none of mine even came close to that. Also, you want your slides to be consistent. If you use a template in Word or a template in Prezi, you almost can't help but be consistent. But with visual aids, you don't want you want to keep them consistent because otherwise your audience's brains have to work too hard to figure things out. So if every slide has in a heading and bullet points and a graphic at the same slide, in a certain sense you might think that's a little bit boring, you know, that you're using the same colors and the same font and all of that. But it really, once again, is about your audience and not about you. And it's about helping them not focus on the differences, but to focus on the material that is actually on your slides. In terms of graphics, you should pretty much never use more than 1 graphic per slide. And you also need to keep them very, very simple. If there's something that has detail, that's a graph, or something that has a lot of information, give that as a handout, but don't put it up. And for heaven's sakes, what I really hate is, I know that this is hard to see, but if you know it's hard to see, then don't put it up as a visual aid. Do me that favor. All right. Color is very important. And again, Word and Prezi both do a pretty good job of, you need to pick a color that is consistent with your audience. Again, that goes back to thinking about your audience and what would roll in their worlds. Some of your audiences are going to prefer something that's a little bit more contemporary or a little bit more conservative, where some audiences you might be able to get away with something that's a little bit more contemporary. And lastly, you want to make sure that the font size is large enough for your audience to see. That is probably the one thing that I don't particularly like about a number of Word slides, and that is the built-in font size on the template is often too small. I generally recommend that you should have at least 36-point font size on your slides. So keep them simple and follow these rules for good PowerPoint or Prezi presentations that are going to be the visual aid that helps reinforce the message that you are giving to your audience. So there you have it. We talked about preparing for a painless presentation and delivery. We talked about some practical tips for presentation and delivery, and we also talked about how you can most effectively use your